Embarking on an uncertain journey, hundreds of former child soldiers who once made up Nepal's Maoist rebellion are taking their first steps back into civilian society. For more than 3 years, they've called containment camps such as these home, all part of the peace deal to end a decade-long civil war which had claimed 13,000 lives. More than 20,000 former rebels are supposed to be integrated into Nepal's military, but their minor counterparts are ineligible, and many question what their future will hold once they swap their army fatigues for civilian clothes.
During the war, we fought and suffered. Now I have been disqualified. It is another form of suffering, and we are supposed to leave the camps. It is really unfair after what we did.
The Maoists were notorious for sending minors into the battlefield. Rights groups speak of entire classrooms being abducted from remote villages and families forced to give up one child to join the fight. The UN assessed in 2006 that nearly 3,000 of the former rebels were minors. Most are adults today, although roughly 500 are still under the age of 18. And about 20 are thought to be under 16, which means they were in uniform from the age of 12 or 13. Trained to fight and scarred by war, these young adults are now expected to head home to a life they hardly know. Gerald Tan, Al Jazeera.
Roderick Chalmers is the South Asia Deputy Project Director of the International Crisis Group. It provides analysis and advice on world conflicts, and he joins us on the phone now from Kathmandu. Firstly, I have to ask you, many of them, as that report said, grew up fighting or being trained to fight. How are they going to reintegrate back into society?
Well, that's the main question that we have to look at the moment, because unfortunately the Maoists and the other parties in government couldn't in the end reach agreement on what kind of rehabilitation packages would be offered to these young people. So many of them are now being discharged with no clear idea of where they'll go. It's quite possible that some of them may even remain with the Maoists in one way or another, not in the cantonment with other combatants, but perhaps still associated with the party that they still see as their provider and the organisation that will look after them. For the moment, they're just being given a small amount of pocket money, effectively, to cover their travel home. But there's no guarantee of work and no guarantee of training to find employment.
So this basically is not a recipe for success in any way. And the other thing that is flaming the fans of a possible Maoist violent resurrection, is the fact that 20,000 other soldiers are still in these camps, and pending their release, the army doesn't want them to be reintegrated into the national army. So what's going to happen to them? And could this even lead to maybe a Maoist resurgence?
Absolutely. Well, there is, of course, a huge debate still to be had about what to do with those combatants who were verified by the UN as being genuine combatants. The ones who are being discharged now, and this is a process that will last for some weeks, are only those who more than 2 years ago were deemed to be not eligible as true combatants. But I think we should accept that this is a major step forward. It's long overdue. This should have happened 2 years back. But the fact that at last it is going ahead does mean that there is some goodwill, perhaps, that can now be applied to the question of what to do with those 19,000. The big problem, as you pointed out, is that there's a major disagreement as to whether or not large numbers of them can go into the state army. The Maoists have long been pushing for the integration of most of them into the state army, and indeed for that army to be significantly reformed and brought under democratic control. That has only happened in the most partial fashion so far, and there's not yet any agreement on whether those who can't go into the army would go into other security forces, such as the police, or would be rehabilitated in other ways. I don't think this in itself causes or poses a risk of an insurrection, but as long as you have two separate armies in the country, it's hard to say that the peace process has reached a stage near conclusion.
Now, the release of these 200 child soldiers, as you said, is a major step, and many are hailing this as a huge step in the peace process. But it seems that there's very little support for this 200 that is going back out into society. So why is this hailed or being marked as such a big step in the peace process?
Well, as I say, it's a big step in this going forward at all, and we have to remember that the Maoists themselves had stalled on this time and time again over the last 2 years, and other parties had shown themselves somewhat unwilling to reach a compromise. But when we're looking towards the future and what all of these other combatants, as they gradually rehabilitate their interest into other security forces will do, we have to remember that this is a very broad peace process. At the same time as these steps with combatants are going on, a new constitution is meant to be being written. Nepal is meant to be turned into a federal state rather than a central state. That's going to involve very major changes to the configuration of the country's politics and other institutions. And all of those other processes are also facing quite severe political difficulties in terms of negotiating how they'll go forward. Now, the new constitution is meant to be in place by the end of May, and the Prime Minister has now promised that he will try and see through the demobilization of the remaining Maoist fighters by the end of April. That's a very optimistic timetable, but perhaps over-optimistic given the challenges that still remain to create a consensus about what to do with them.
Roderick Chalmers with the International Crisis Group speaking to us from Kathmandu. Thank you very much for your time.